Hello and welcome to another Java video tutorial. First of all, I'd like to thank everyone that's been subscribing over the last while. It really helps. It's nice to know people are interested in the content that I'm producing. So big thanks to everyone that's subscribing. If you haven't already subscribed to the channel, please do. Please leave some comments down below. If you like the videos, give them a thumbs up and hit the notification bell to make sure that you don't miss any more videos. In this video, we are going to take a look at file.io. We're going to look at how we can write code to input and output information from files. Now we need to do this because if we rely on just storing all the data in our programs in memory, obviously when the program finishes running, then all of that data is gone. So we can't rely on storing all of our data in memory all of the time. So we need at some point to be able to write our data out to some other form of storage that is more permanent. And then we'll be able to retrieve that data at a later point when our program runs again. So that's why we need to look at file.io. And in this video, we'll look at a very simple type of file called a text file. You're familiar with text files already because if you've been typing programs in on your computer using a text editor, well, the text editor saves your .java file out to your computer's hard disk in a text file format. So if you open up that text file, you'll see all the characters and line spaces and spaces that make up your file. And each line in a text file is ended with an end of line character. Now you can't see that end of line character, but it is there, and that represents the end of a line and the beginning of a new line. So when your text editor reads your program back in from the disk, from a file, it can present the text that's contained in that file in the editor exactly the way you had laid it out when you saved your code or saved your Java program. So we're going to look at how we can write our own code to firstly write information out to a text file, and then we'll look at some code that will allow us to read that information back in from a text file into our programs. Okay, so let's get started. Okay, so the first thing that I'm going to do is create a file called text_file.io. And we're going to use this file to demonstrate how we can write information in and out of our program to the computer's hard disk in the format of a text file. Okay, so first things first, let's make our class. So I'm going to call this class text_file.io. And of course, IO stands for input and output. And of course, I'm going to save this file as text_file.io.java. So this is where we're going to begin. Okay, now the first thing that we need to do is we need to have some data that we want to be able to write out to our file first of all, and then read the information back in from the file. Okay, so there are lots of different ways we can make some data. We could create an array, for example, of some data and maybe write the contents of the array out to a file and save the file. It could be just a single value like a variable or something like that, although that might not be very much use. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the approach of creating a collection of data that we might want to store, and then we'll write that information out to a text file, and then we'll have the ability to then read that back in the future. So we haven't lost the data. The data is persistent. It's held long term in a file on our computer's hard disk. Okay. So first of all, I'm going to write a main method. So public static void main, and all the usual stuff in there. And we're going to create some data first of all. Okay, now as I said, we could use an array. We could create an array of data and write that data out to the hard disk. Okay, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a more dynamic data structure, a collection of items that I want to write out to the file. So I'm going to use an array list. Okay, now if you haven't ever used a Java ArrayList before, I have a video that details how to use the ArrayList. It's kind of like an introduction to using Java ArrayLists, and I kind of show some of the differences between using an array and a Java ArrayList, which is more dynamic. So I'll leave a link to that video somewhere here. You'll see it appearing somewhere now. And please go and have a look at that video to make sure that you understand how an array list works, and then maybe come back to this one and you'll see how we can write that information out to the hard disk in the form of a text file. Okay, so first of all, if I'm going to use the array list, I am going to need to import it. So I'm going to say import java.util ArrayList, and there's a number of other things that I'm going to have to import in order to be able to write the data out to disk, but I'll leave that for the moment. We'll come back and revisit our little import section here in a few minutes. So let's get our data created first of all, and then we'll begin to write the data out to disk. Okay, so I'm going to create an array list. So in my main method, I'm going to say array list, and of course I have to specify what type of information I'm going to store in my array list. I'm just going to store strings for the moment anyway, because that's a pretty basic type of object that I can store in an array list. And as you can see, I'm going to make like a shopping list. You know, it's just going to be an array list that contains strings that could represent items on a shopping list. So I'm going to use a string, an array list of strings to do that. Okay, so I have array list string, and then I'm going to call my array list items. And then what do I need to do next? I need to say items equals new array list. And again, I need to specify in angle brackets that it's going to be a string array list, and then I need a set of brackets at the end, just like that. Okay, so that creates my array list, and then I want to add some data to my array list. Okay, so let's add some data. So I can say items dot add, and we'll add some items, add some shopping list items to our array list. Let's say I'll add in maybe an item called bread, and then I'll add in maybe an item called milk, and I'm just copy and pasting the line of code down here just to make life a little bit easy for me. Pasta, and let's say we need some butter. Okay, that's enough items for the moment. Let's say 4 items. Okay, so we have our array list. And what I'll do just very quickly is let's just output the array list, just so we can confirm that we do indeed have an array list and those items are in the array list and they're there, and then we can begin to write them out to a file. Okay, so let's output the array list. So I'm just going to use a for loop to do this. There are other ways to do it, but I'll just use a for loop for the moment. So I'll say items, and of course when we're using an array list, we don't use the dot length field to specify the length of the array. We use dot size, and size is a method, so we need to put in those brackets there, and then I'm going to have I++. So it's kind of like a standard loop, for loop, to just iterate over the items that are in the array list. Okay, so what do I want to do? Well, I want to just output the array list, right? So just use the system.out for that. All I'm doing here is just confirming that the items are indeed there. So I'm going to say items dot, how do we get an item out of an array list? Well, get is the keyword, isn't it, there? Because we're going to use the get method. and then the get method takes the index of the item that we want to retrieve. And because we're going around a loop and looping around the array list, I can use my loop index variable I as an index into the array, and I can print that out. Okay, so system.out.println, and the thing that I'm printing out to the screen is items.get, and I'm using I as an index there. Okay, so let's save that first of all, and let's confirm that that works. So I'll bring up a terminal window here, and let's see, Java C, and we'll compile our text file IO program. Oh, I've got some errors. Where have I got errors? Let's see. Oh, let's do that again. Let's clear that again so we can see those errors. Okay. Am I missing a semicolon somewhere? Yeah, well, what have I got wrong here in my program? Let's see. Ah, of course, I know what I've got wrong. I'm missing my new keyword. How silly of me to do that. Okay, so it's ArrayList items equals new ArrayList. I forgot to use the new keyword. Okay, so let's save that, and hopefully we have no more syntax errors. So let's see. Let's compile it. Yes, no more syntax errors. So I just forgot my new keyword there. And let's run the program. And we see we get our nice output to the screen here. So we get our items that are in our array list output to the screen. Okay, so we've confirmed we have our data, and the code is working to put the data into the array list. But when the program finishes, when the program ends, that's it, that data is gone. The only way I have of getting that data back again is to run the program again. And then it's there while the program is running, and then once the program ends again, that data is gone. It doesn't live on after the program has finished executing, and that's the problem. So that's what I want to solve now. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to write a method to take the data in the array list and write it out to a text file. Okay, so let's do that. All right, so I'm going to do this as a method because it just becomes more useful then if I have it as a method. Okay, so I'm going to create a public method. Now, because I'm going to call this method from the main method, this also has to be a static method. So it's going to be public static void, and I'm going to call this, what will I call it? I'll call it write file. Okay, now this write file method is going to look after taking the data and writing it out to a file. So what do I need to create a file? Well, I need a file name, right? I need to have some way of referencing the file on the disk. And how do we do that? We use a file name, okay? And files are stored in certain locations. File can be in a folder, and that folder can be in another folder and another folder, and so on and so on. So a file has a location on the disk that's given by the path to the file. Now, I'm not going to worry too much about paths in this tutorial. I'm just going to give our write file method a file name, and what that's going to do is it's going to basically write the data out to a file with the given file name, and it's going to put that file in the same folder as my program. It's just going to be stored in the same location as the program source code. So how do I do that? Well, I'm going to create a parameter in this for this method write file, and it's going to be of type string, and this parameter is going to be called file name. So it will literally be a string that contains the name of the file that I want to write the data out to. Okay. Now, the next thing that I want to do is, well, what data do I want to actually write out? Where is the data, or what is the data that I want to actually write out to the file? Well, my data is stored in this array list, isn't it? It's in here. Okay, right in this array list that I have here called items. So what I would like to be able to do is I'd like to be able to pass that array list over to this writeFile method so that I can iterate through the array list and write the information out to my file. So I'm going to have a parameter in this writeFile method, which is just an array list. It's going to be an array list of strings. So the parameter is going to be called ArrayList, and it's going to contain strings. And I'm going to call this ArrayList, I'll just call it data. Okay. Oh, I need a method body, so I better put in my brackets. Okay, right. Okay, so that's what the method is going to look like. Okay, that's the method declaration. It's going to be called writeFile. It's not going to return anything. It's a static method because I want to be able to call this method from the main method, and because the main method is a static method, then this also has to be a static method. Okay, so what am I going to do inside of this writeFile method? Well, I want to create a file and I want to write the data out to the file. So how do I do that? Well, in Java, Java has a package called java.io, and in this Java package, this IO package, Java has a whole bunch of classes that allow us to read and write information to files. Now, the way Java handles this is that everything in terms of input and output in Java is kind of treated like a stream. Okay, so what is a stream? Well, a stream is a flow of water, isn't it? I mean, a stream in nature is a flow of water. Well, in Java, a stream is a flow of data, and that data goes from a source to a sink. Okay, so the data actually originates somewhere and it flows through the stream to go to another location. So Java treats all of its input and output as this idea of a stream, and streams are very central to the way Java handles its input and output. So behind the scenes, this is what's actually happening. Java is using streams to input and output our data. So what we're going to do is we are first of all going to import the java.io package. So I'm going to say import java.io. Now, there are loads of class files in here, and rather than import them individually as I need them, for the moment what I'm going to do, because it's just the easiest thing to do, is I'm going to import java.io.star. And the .star here at the end of that import statement tells Java to just import all of the classes from the IO package. Okay, I could import them individually, but it's just too much hassle. I want to keep it simple, so I'll just import everything from the IO package. So that wildcard of the star there, it tells Java to just import everything. Okay, so now that I've got that package included, I can now go and start writing my file IO code. Okay, so the first thing that we need to do before we start to write our file IO code is we need to wrap everything up in a try and catch block. So let's put the try and catch block in first, and then I'll explain why we need a try and catch block. And by the way, if you haven't used try and catch blocks before, or you don't understand what they are, I do have a tutorial that walks you through using try and catch blocks. In fact, there are really two, so I'll link them up here somewhere around here about now, and I'll also leave a link to those videos in the description below. So definitely go and check those out, and they'll walk you through using try and catch blocks. Okay, so let's put the try and catch block in first. try. So every try block needs a catch, and the exception that we are going to catch here is called an IO exception. Okay, so we need this catch block here to catch any runtime exceptions that are going to happen when we try and do our file code, our file output code. So why do we need a try and catch block? Okay, well, what we're going to essentially do is we're going to try and create a file on the disk, and we're going to try to write information to that file. Now, there are a number of things that could go wrong in that process. For example, maybe the disk is full. Okay, maybe there's no more space to write information to the hard drive. That's a possibility. The other possibility is that maybe we don't have permissions to write information to the disk in that particular location. So there are a number of things that can happen that are kind of out of our control in terms of our program code. And those things that can happen, those bad things that can happen when we're trying to write the information to the hard disk, will cause our program to experience a runtime exception, a runtime error. Okay, so while the program is executing, if it can't write the information to the disk or it can't create the file, there will be a runtime error. And we need to handle that runtime error using this try and catch block. Okay, so what we're going to do first of all is the very first file object that I'm going to use is going to be a class called FileWriter. Okay, so I'm going to create a FileWriter. Okay, so FileWriter in Java is a class that is part of this Java IO package. And it's this FileWriter class that's going to actually create the file for me. Okay, so I'll say FileWriter, and I'm going to call this FileWriter object FW. Okay, so FileWriter FW. And I'm going to say that equals a new FileWriter. Okay, so FileWriter FW equals new FileWriter, and the FileWriter constructor, the constructor for that FileWriter object, there's a number of different versions of it. Okay, one of them takes a string that represents the file name that we want to create. There's another one that takes an actual file object. There's another class that's part of that Java IO package called file, and that represents an actual file on the hard disk. So we could create one of those and pass it over to the FileWriter object. And there's yet another version of the FileWriter constructor that actually takes a second parameter, a Boolean parameter, that allows us to either create a brand new file, even if that file already exists, and it kind of overwrites the file that's already there, or we could decide to append information to an existing file. And so that allows us to do that. So that's an extra parameter, and I'll actually show you how that works in a few minutes. But for the moment, what we're going to do is we're just going to give the FileWriter object the name of the file that we want to create. And we're going to do that by giving it this formal parameter called file name. So we have this string formal parameter here called file name, and I'm just going to pass that over to the FileWriter. So I'm going to say file name, and what that will do is the FileWriter will create that file on the hard disk for us. And once that happens, then we'll be able to write to the file. Okay, now we could actually use this FileWriter object directly to write information out to the hard disk. Okay, absolutely could do that. There's no problem doing that. But I'm going to create another object that will allow us to do that a little bit more easily. And this object that I'm going to create is a PrintWriter object. So the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to create something called a PrintWriter. And I'm going to call this PW PrintWriter. Okay, and that's going to be equal to a new PrintWriter. And this PrintWriter object is going to kind of create a wrapper around my FileWriter object. Okay, so I'm going to be able to use the PrintWriter, and the PrintWriter then in turn will communicate with the FileWriter object. So the way I need to do this is when I have the constructor here for the PrintWriter object, I'm going to pass over the FileWriter object that I created called FW. I'm going to pass that over to the PrintWriter object. So the PrintWriter gets the FileWriter object, and then we can work with the PrintWriter, PW. Okay. Now the reason why I'm doing this is because the PrintWriter object, or the PrintWriter class in Java, allows us to treat writing to a file in the same way as we write to the screen. So we're already familiar with the methods, the system.out.print and system.out.println and system.out.printf. We're already familiar with those methods that we can use to write to the screen. But now this PrintWriter object is actually going to allow us to use those same methods that we're already familiar with, and instead of writing to the screen, we're going to be able to write to a file. Okay, so it changes the output really of where we're writing to. Instead of writing to the screen, and we've set up our file and our PrintWriter object so that we can use those same methods and now output to a file. Okay, so there they are, our two objects, our two file input and output objects that we're going to use as part of this. Okay, so what do we want to do next? Well, next of all, what I'd like to do is actually write the data out to the file. So I need to create a loop to do that. Now look, I've already got a loop down here that loops through my array list and prints them to the screen. So I'm going to copy that because the code I need to put in here next is almost exactly the same. So I'm going to copy that code and I'm going to put it up here. And I'm going to look at the loop to see what I need to change. So I don't really need to change for int I equal to 0. Do I need to change I less than? Well, my data isn't called items in here. It's actually called data. So the name of the formal parameter that I'm passing in is called data. So I'm going to change items to data. And I'm still going to use data.size. I'm still going to increment I. And what I'm doing in here currently is, of course, I'm printing the information out to the screen. Now, we don't want to do that in here. I want to print the information out to a file. So I'm going to change this system.out, not system.out, because that will write it to the screen. And instead, I'm going to say pw.println, and that's going to print out to the file instead of printing to the screen. Okay, well, what do I want to print? Well, again, my data is not called items in this method. It's actually called data. Okay, so it's this parameter that's getting passed in. So I must change items here to data. And what do I want to print out? Well, I still want to print out data.getI. I still want to iterate through each array list item and print it out individually. So what's going to happen is, because I'm using a println on my PrintWriter, each item in the array list will be printed to the file on its own line, and then we'll go to the next line and print the next item out to the file, and so on and so on. So in the file, the data will be structured just as it is on the screen here. When we printed it to the screen, it will look the same, except now instead of being on the screen, it's going to be in a file. Okay, and that's pretty much it. Create the FileWriter with the file name, create the PrintWriter that's going to use the FileWriter, and then create a loop that's going to loop around the data, and then I'm going to use the PrintWriter object and println to print each item on its own line in the file. Okay, now after the loop, when that for loop is finished, I will be done with writing out the data to the file, and I'm kind of finished with the file at that point. I've written all the data out to the file. So what do I need to do next? Well, it's important that I close the file, and to do that I can say pw.close, and that's a method of the PrintWriter class. I can say pw.close and I can close the file. The reason why we need to do that, and I won't get into it too much now, is that opening up a file on any operating system uses up a resource, and if we don't close those resources down, or we don't manage those resources correctly, we can run into problems. As well as that, if we don't close the file properly, we run the risk that the file may become corrupt or something might happen to the data in the file, and obviously we don't want to do that. So it's important that we close the file, and I can do that by saying pw.close. Okay. And finally, we need to fill out this catch block down here. Well, if something goes wrong with writing the information to my file, I'm just going to print out a very simple error message down here using a system.out println, and I'm just going to keep this kind of simple. I'm just going to say error cannot write to file, and I'll also provide the file name there because we got that passed over as a parameter, and I'm just going to keep it simple and print out an error message like that. Okay, so that's it. That is the write file method. As you can see, it's not really that complicated. You do have to have your try and catch block, and then in the try we create the file IO objects that we need to use, and then I have a loop to loop through to print out the data to the file, and then I just close the file, and that's it. Okay, so how are we going to use this write file method? Well, I can go back down to my main program or my main method, and when I'm finished writing the information out to the screen, so I'll change my little comment here. I'll say output to screen, and then what I'm going to do is I'll put in another little comment in here. Let me move this up a little bit so you can see it a bit better. I'll put in another little comment here, and I'll say output to file. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a call to the write file method. So I'm going to call the write file method, and what's the first parameter? Well, the first parameter is a file name, so I've got to give it a file name. I'm going to call my file, now bearing in mind this is a text file, so I'm going to call my file shopping.txt. Okay, so I'm going to call the file shopping.txt. That's going to be the name of the file that gets created. And what else do I need to do? Well, what's the second parameter that I need to pass over? Well, the second parameter that I need to pass over is the data that I want to actually write out to the file. So where is my data? If I have a look at the main method, you'll see that I create my data here, my array list. And in the main method, that array list is called items. So I'm just going to pass over items to this method, to this call to write file. Okay, and that's all I need to do. I just need to call the write file, I need to give it a file name, and I need to pass over the data that I want to write out to the file, and hopefully this works. Okay, so the first thing is, let's hold our breath, save this and see there's a compile. Okay, so Java C, text file io.java, hopefully it compiles. Yes, compiles, no errors, but does it work? Okay, let's run it and see does it do anything. Okay, so let's execute it. Okay, now it has definitely output the items from the array list onto my screen. We can see them there. Okay, has it created the shopping.txt file? How do we know? Well, remember, I just gave it a file name. I just gave my program a file name, so it should have created the shopping.txt file in the same directory, in the same folder as my program. So if I look in this folder, I should be able to see whether the shopping.txt file is there. Okay, I'm on a Mac, and my terminal uses Unix-like command line commands around the file system. So to see whether this shopping.txt file is there, I'm going to type in ls, and we will see that lo and behold, look, I've got my text file IO class file that's the code that got compiled when I compiled my Java file. But look, I now have a shopping.txt file. Okay, so what's in this shopping.txt file? Well, guess what? It's just a text file, so I can open it in my editor. So let's do that and see whether or not the data is in the text file. So I can go to my editor and I go File, Open, and I can open the shopping.txt file, and we can see that indeed, we have a look, there are our items in the shopping.txt file. Okay, so they're there. It works. The write file method works. It takes our data that's stored in our array list and writes it out to our shopping.txt file. Okay, so that's good. Everything works. Let's go back to our code here for a second, because the next thing that I want to show you is that this FileWriter object, or this FileWriter class that we're using, as I said earlier on, if we just give it a file name, what it will do is it will check to see if that file already exists on the hard drive, and if it doesn't exist, it will create the file, as we've just seen there. If the file already exists, what it will do is it will truncate the file. It will overwrite the information that's in the file. So every time we write to the file, it will basically overwrite or get rid of the current contents of the file, and then it will write the new information to the file. How do we get around that? Well, in this FileWriter class, there is a constructor that takes two parameters, and the second parameter that it takes is a Boolean parameter, and if we pass over true this Boolean parameter, so if I just pass over true, what that will do is, instead of overwriting the current contents of the file, it will append the information to the file. So it will not get rid of the current information, it will just add on the information to the end of the text file. Okay, so if we run our program again with this new parameter set to true, what will happen is we should get a duplicate shopping list. We should see those items appear again in the shopping list.txt file. So let's save that, and we'll go out and recompile the program, because we've changed the code. So I'm going to recompile the program, and okay, so we'll compile it there, and I'll run it again, and we get our output to the screen of bread, milk, pasta, butter. Okay, but what has it done to the shopping.txt file? Well, let's open the shopping.txt file and see. So we'll go File, Open, and I'll reopen the shopping.txt file. And as you can see, we now have bread, milk, butter, pasta. That was the original contents that got written out to the file the first time round. And by passing over the true parameter, what it has done is it has now added on bread, milk, pasta, and butter onto the original contents of the file. So we get that data written or appended to the end of the text file. Okay. Now, if you don't want that behavior, let's close down the shopping list file again. If you don't want that behavior, if you don't want to append the information to the file, you might want to do that, for example, if you were keeping a log file. Okay, so if you're going to create a file that you need to write to and add information to it over time, well then of course you want to append the information to the end of the file, right? So maybe like a log file, or some kind of transaction file that you want to keep adding information to. So then you would not want to overwrite the file, you'd want to truncate the information, or you would want to append the information to the end of the file. So you might want to set that parameter to true, give it the file name and true, and then it will append the information to the file. I don't want to do that this time around. I just wanted to overwrite the file. So I'm going to take that true back out. And when we run it again, you'll see that the shopping list won't have the duplicate items in it. It will go back to having just a single shopping list set of items in there again. So I'll save this again and go out to my command line, recompile, run the program. Okay, we get our items written to the screen, absolutely fine. Let's open the shopping list.txt file again, our shopping.txt file again, and we'll see what the contents look like. So file open. I'm just opening, it's in the same folder as my source code. I'm just going to open it again, and as you can see, we are now back to those original items. Now what has happened is the file was already there, and it just overwrote the contents of the file with those 4 items. So you can see how that works. Okay, right, what's next? Well, what's next is we have written the data out to a file, and that's great, and we can look at that file, and that's fine. What about if we want to read that information back in at some later point? Well, we're going to have to write some code to do that, aren't we? So the next method that I'm going to write is going to be public static void, and this method is going to be called read file. Okay, and what am I going to need to read a file? Well, I need to know the name of the file, so I'm going to have string file name, right? And then I'm going to read the data from the file. So I need somewhere to put the data, right? I need to store the data somewhere. There's no point in me just writing it to the screen, because if I just write the data to the screen, well, then I can't really do anything with it. So I have to put the data into something that's going to store it in the computer's memory. So again, I'm going to use an array list for this. Now, there's another reason why I've chosen to use an array list for this little example. I'll put in the parameter first, and then I'll explain why. So it's going to be array list. Again, it's strings, right? So it's kind of the same as before, just going to be like that. Okay. Now, the reason why I didn't use an array for this, a standard array, and I used an array list, is that when we're reading the information back in from a file, we have no idea how many items are in that file. Okay, so unless I check beforehand, unless I open the file with something else and count how many lines of text are in the file, then I've no way of knowing how many lines are in the file. I've no way of knowing how much data I'm dealing with. So if I try to use an array, well, that's not going to work, because I need to create the array, and the array has a fixed size. But if I have no idea how many lines of text are in the text file that I'm trying to read in, well, then I can't use an array. So I need to use some kind of dynamic data structure, and that's the reason I've used an array list for this job of writing information in and out of the file, because the array list is a dynamic data structure, and we don't need to know how many lines are in the file. I can just read in a line, add it to my array list, read in another line, add it to my array list, read in another line, add it to my array list. You get the message, okay? So that's why I'm using an array list. An array just wouldn't work here, because it has a fixed size, and I'd have to know how many items were in the file before I open it for reading, which isn't really very good. Okay, so first thing that I need is a try and catch block. Again, same reasons as before, because when we're dealing with files, there are a number of things that can go wrong. when we're trying to read the file from the disk. So I need to be able to catch those runtime exceptions. For example, what about if the file got deleted? I try to open the file isn't there. What happens? I get a runtime exception. So I must handle that runtime exception using my try and catch block. Okay, inside of the try block, I'm going to use, well, what did I use in writing a file? I used a FileWriter. Guess what I'm going to use here? I'm going to use a FileReader. So I'm going to say FileReader, FR this time, FileReader, equals new FileReader. And what am I going to pass over to the FileReader? I'm going to pass over the file name that I got passed in as a formal parameter. So I'm going to try to open that file name using this FileReader. Okay, so it's pretty straightforward once you know what to do, and you can see the similarities between the writing to a file and reading from a file. So we have a FileReader. Okay, now one of the issues with this FileReader is that it will allow me to read from the file. Okay, I could use the FileReader straight away, and I could start reading information from the file. The problem is though, the FileReader will only allow me to read the file, read the text file, character by character. Okay, so I read the first character, I can do something with it. I read the second character, I can do something with it. And that's not very useful to me, because what I would like to be able to do is I'd like to be able to read in the file line by line. Okay, I want to read the first line of the text file, then the second line, then the third line, and so on. So that's a much nicer way for me to read in my shopping list items. You can read it character by character, and if that's what you wanted to do, read it by individual character by character, you could use the FileReader class to do that. I don't want to do that. I want to read it line by line. So what I need to create next is I need to create something called a buffered reader. Okay, this buffered reader, what that's going to do is it's going to enable me to read a whole line of the file in one go, and that's what I'd like to do. So I'm going to create a buffered reader, and I'm going to call that BR. That's going to be equal to new buffered reader. And this is the same approach as before with the FileWriter and the PrintWriter. The buffered reader is going to create a wrapper around the FileReader object, and it's going to allow me to read the file line by line. So I'm going to pass over the FR, the FileReader, to the buffered reader constructor. So I'm going to use those two objects together to read the information from my file. Okay. So I have my file objects set up now for reading the information in from the file. So what do I need to do next? Okay, well, the next thing that I need to do is I'm going to read in the information from the file line by line. So each line in the file is going to basically be a string. It's going to be a collection of characters. So I'm going to create a string variable here called line. And as I read information from the file, I'm going to store it in this string variable called line. Okay. And then the next thing that I need to do is I need to write a loop. And this loop is going to continuously read information from the text file until we get to the end of the file. And when we get to the end of the file, then we'll stop reading information from the file. So this while loop is going to look like this. We're going to have while, and of course we're going to have a loop body. Now, what's the guard of the while loop going to be? Okay, this is a little bit tricky, but what I'll do is I'll write the code and then I'll break it down and explain what's happening inside of this loop. Okay, so we're going to say, I'm going to have another set of brackets in here, and in this inner set of brackets, I'm going to say line equals, and then I'm going to say br dot read line. Okay, so br dot read line, and then outside of that set of inner brackets, so that those set of inner brackets, and we have another set of brackets there. So this read line method is part of the buffered reader. Okay, so dot read line, open bracket, close bracket, that's the method call that I'm using on the buffered reader. That's going to read in a line of text from the file, and it's going to assign it to my string variable called line. All right, now every time around the loop this is going to happen. This inner set of brackets is going to happen. It's going to be repeated, and I put it in as part of the guard because it's just kind of convenient for me to do it that way. Every time I go around the loop, I'm going to kind of do this as part of the guard. Okay, now what I need to do is I need to check to see have we reached the end of the file. What will happen is when we reach the end of the file, this br.readLine will have no more data to read. And what it will do is when it reaches the end of the file and it has no more data to read, it will return a null. Okay, so rather than returning a piece of information that I'm going to put into my string variable, it will return a null. And when it returns a null value, then that's it. I'm finished reading the information from the file. So really what I want to do is I want to continue looping around and reading lines from the file until or as long as that br.readLine is not equal to null. Okay, so that's my loop. That's my while loop. Okay, there's a little bit going on there. Okay, as I said, this inner piece is going to read a line from the file, and it's going to store it in my string variable called line. Now br.readLine will continue to do that quite happily, line after line after line, but then when it reaches the end of the file, it gives back a null. So I want to continue to do that as long as br.readLine is not equal to null, or as long as my line variable has a piece of data in it. Okay, so by saying not equal to null, we're saying keep doing it as long as you don't reach the end of the file. Okay, now inside of this loop then, what do I want to do? Well, I'm reading information from the file, and each line in the file will be stored in my string variable line. Okay, so now that I have a piece of information in that string variable, what do I want to do? Well, I want to add it into my array list. I want to add it to my data. Okay, so all I'm going to do in here is I'm going to say data dot add line. Okay, so data is the name of the array list I passed over as a formal parameter, and so I'm saying data dot add, which adds a piece of information to the array list. What do I want to add? Well, I want to add in that line. I want to add that line that I just captured from the text file into my array list. So I say data.add line, and we continue around the loop. We continue going around and around the loop, grabbing each line of text from the text file and putting it into our array list. And that's pretty much it. Yeah, that's it. I can try and run this code. I need an error message in my catch block. So let's say system.out.println, and I will say error cannot read from file, and again I'll print out the file name. Okay, so that's it. Oh, I suppose I should close the file as well. After telling you that you should do that, I suppose I should close the file as well. So as I br.close, save that, and let's go now and test out that method. Okay, so what have we got here? We've got some data. We create some data. Now we've already written that data out to our shopping.txt file. Okay, let's open the text file. Just let's confirm that that is the case. File open, and I'll open the shopping.txt file. Okay, so there's the shopping.txt file. All right, That's what's currently in the shopping.txt file, our items here: bread, milk, pasta, butter. Now, just to show you that this works and to confirm that it works, what I'm going to do is I'm going to cheat a little bit here, and I'm going to, using the text editor, I'm going to add, I'll actually add an item to the start of the list. So I'll add in coffee, very important, and then I'll add in an item to the end of the file. So I'll add in chocolate. Okay, and I'm going to save the shopping.txt file. All right, I'll close that down. Okay, now in the main method, what I need to do is I need to create the array list. Okay, so I need to have an array list. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to comment out where I add the items to the array list. Okay, so I'm going to comment those out. So I'm no longer adding items to the array list. Okay, there's nothing in it. I just basically create an empty array list of strings, but I do not add the items to the array list. So I've got an empty array list. And then what I'm going to do is, okay, what do I want to do down here? I don't want to write to the file, so I'm going to actually comment that out as well. But what I do want to do is I want to read from the file. Okay, so I'm going to create the array list. I am not adding any items to the array list, and what I'm going to do here is I'm going to read in the information from the file. So I'm going to say read file. What's the name of my file? Well, it's called shopping.txt, and then I want to read from the file, and I want to store the information from the file back into my array list. So I'm going to pass over my items parameter here. So that's the name of my array list in the main method. It's called items, and I want to pass that over. So hopefully this method is going to open up the file. It's going to read the information line by line and store it in my items array list. Now, once it has done that, what I can do is this piece of code that I had from before is just going to iterate through the array list and print those items to the screen. So if it has worked, what I should see on the screen is the shopping list with those extra 2 items that I added to it. The coffee at the start and the chocolate at the end. Okay, so let's, again, fingers crossed, and hopefully this compiles and works. So I'll save that. We'll go out to our command window, and I'll say Java C textfile.io.java. Compiles. Okay. Alright, but the proof of the pudding is in the eating, so we need to execute it to see that it works. So Java text file IO. I'll hit enter, and hey, look what happened. We now have those items being printed to the screen, but where did they come from? They came from our read file method. Our read file method read those items from the text file line by line. It populated our array list, and then we printed our array list to the screen, and you can see that we now have the updated shopping list, the one with the extra item at the beginning and the extra item at the end. Okay, so let's kind of give a little summary here before I finish up. We created some data to start off with. We're using an array list. The reason why we're using an array list is because we need to use a dynamic data structure, especially when we're reading the information back in from the file, because I don't know how many lines are in the file prior to opening the file and just reading it line by line. So an array list is really good for this particular example. And then what we did was we developed a method to write the array list out to a file. We gave it a file name. We used the FileWriter, and we demonstrated how we could append information using the FileWriter and the parameter, the Boolean parameter set to true. We're using a Printwriter because that makes it convenient for us to print to the file in the same way as we would print to the screen. we had a loop that looped around the array list, iterated over the array list, and then we printed each line in the file using println, and we wrote the array list item out to the file. Of course, we closed their file once we were finished, and all of that was wrapped up in a try and catch block. And then for the read file, well, the read file, again, we have our try and catch block. We used a FileReader object this time to open the file. And then we could have used the FileReader object to read it character by character, but instead we created this BufferedReader object, and the BufferedReader object allows us to read it line by line. We have a local variable here called string that's going to just capture each line from the file. And of course, our while loop here is doing all the work. That one line in the while loop just does all the work for us. And then in the body of the while loop, we can just add each line that we read from the file back into our array list. We close the file and we're done. Okay, so that was a very basic introduction to file I/O in Java, and in particular file I/O for text files. There are other types of files that we'll deal with later on. But text files are the easiest ones to deal with because we can open them up and actually look at the contents. You saw that we opened the shopping.txt file up in our text editor, and we could look at the contents, and we could even manipulate the contents in our text editor. You know, this becomes very important when we want to be able to store information in our from our programs in a more long-term sense. We can write it out to a file and then read it back in later on. Okay, so that was file I/O with text files in Java. If you thought this was any good, if you found some useful information in this video and it helped you out in any shape or form, please leave a comment. Give the video a thumbs up. If you really like the content, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so that you get notified of any more videos that I upload. And once again, thanks for looking at the video. Stay tuned, and I'll see you later.